Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the dark side. I mean, the A side. I am your host, Riley, and today I have a review of the newest Hayley Williams solo album, Flowers for Vases. And here we are. Hayley Williams went solo last year with her debut solo album, Petals for Armor, which was one of my favorite releases of last year. I think Hayley did a great job going out on her own and spreading her wings as a solo artist. And this new album, Flowers for Vases, when compared to Petals for Armor, is very disappointing. And it's hard not to compare one to the other because, both were recorded very close back to back. This being a quarantine album, Flowers for Vases, that is recorded over the quarantine throughout 2020. And of course, Petals for Armor dropping in 2020 during quarantine and the whole COVID situation. And both albums having this theme and motif of flowers in the naming. And both albums are pretty introspective and very personal for Hayley Williams. Now, maybe it's not fair to compare these two albums. I mean, this album comes off as so disappointing for a couple of reasons, but mostly because it doesn't have nearly as much character as Petals for Armor did. That's a song that an album that tried a couple different sounds, did some bold things, had some really amazing moments, some very over the top and mind blowing moments like Sudden Desire, and also some more low key moments on it. I think that album overall has a lot of character and a lot of great moments, and this album really doesn't. So maybe it's not fair to compare them. But the album I think we should be comparing this to, the one I at least have compared to the most, is Taylor Swift's Folklore. This album is almost like Hayley Williams' version of Folklore, and they're both very similar in a lot of ways. Both were quarantine albums and surprise releases. Both are very influenced by indie folk and alternative. Both are very slow, sad albums with similar subject matters such as heartbreak and relationships. And both are from leading female figures of their own respective genres. Some of the most famous and important, Taylor Swift in pop and Hayley Williams in rock. Now, I do think that Flowers for Vases, or Vases if you're an asshole, is better than Folklore, but that's mostly because I think Hayley Williams is just more talented than Taylor Swift, both lyrically and vocally. But we'll get to that later. No, the thing that really makes them similar, though, is that they're both really boring. And that's my problem with Flowers for Vases. It's just how boring it is throughout. It's so slow throughout the entirety of the album. That's not always a bad thing. Hayley Williams can pull off slow songs. So many in Paramore's discography, such as my two favorite Paramore songs, Future and Misguided Ghosts, or 26, or even Leave It Alone off of Petals for Armor. But throughout this album, it's just all so slow. Every song is the same, and just how slow it is. It starts to get more repetitive. That's not the only thing that gets repetitive. The instrumentation, too, like I said, is very folk-inspired. So it's the same slow, boring acoustic guitars throughout the entirety of the album. And it's just the same thing over and over and over again. You get sick of it so fast, and the longer the album goes on, the less and less I care about it. I mean, there can be albums that are slow and sad throughout the entirety of its runtime. Take an album like Frank Ocean's Blonde. That's a really good example. But that album keeps things varied. There are different sounds, different moments. This album doesn't. Every song starts to blend together because none of them ever try anything new. Like I said, it's the same acoustic guitars over and over again. It's the same themes over and over again. The same slow, sad, boring, drab kind of sound over and over again, and it becomes a slog to get through, and it loses my interest very fast because it doesn't do anything to grab my interest ever, at least instrumentally and sonically, that is. And the songs, like I said, just start to really blend together, and the production isn't doing the album any favors either, as the production is very sanitized and made to be very soft, almost like a pillow. So you're falling asleep the entire time because there's no edge here in the production, and the songs never vary whatsoever. None of these songs take any risks instrumentally to really set. I shouldn't say none of them, but most of them don't. Most of them don't stand out from one another, and it's really just hard to sit through in a lot of moments. One thing that does save the album, though, is Hayley Williams herself, who is an amazing vocalist and really shows off her vocals here throughout the entirety of the album, hitting both high and low notes and showing an amazing range, and just how beautiful her voice is, and really how far she's come as well. Even though I love All We Know Is Falling and think her vocals sound great on that album too, you can listen to that and then listen to this and just hear how much she's progressed as a vocalist over time. And I also think she's a good lyricist, and a lot of the lyrics here are really good, being about heartbreak and sadness. And sure, it gets a little repetitive lyrically and gets repetitive thematically, but I still think the lyrics are good. There's no really moments on this album where I hear a lyric and just cringe. Lyricism is good throughout, but Hayley Williams has always been a really good lyricist in my opinion. But it is the instrumentation that ruins this album for me, as it gets so boring over time. Really, by like track 4 or 5, I pretty much check out, and as long as the album keeps going, I just care less and less. And I know this is such a personal album for Hayley Williams, so I feel kind of bad saying these things, but it just doesn't work. I know it was made over quarantine, and she made it all by herself, but there are moments on this album that show she could have varied it, done something else, not made it so boring. I don't know, people, oh, it's cohesive. Not really, it's just boring. You can be cohesive and vary your sound, and you don't even have to vary it a lot, just do something else. I mean, The Cure's Disintegration uses pretty much the same instrumentation throughout, but manages to do other things by trying at least a different pattern or a different formula. You've got some bangers like Love Song, you've got the more kind of drawn out song of Pictures of You, which focuses more on the guitars rather than the synthesizers. You've got something like Close Down, which focuses more on the percussion, or like the 8-minute title track that focuses more on the lyricism and kind of does different things even though it's using the same instrumentation. Petals for Armor, or this is Flowers for Vases, doesn't do that whatsoever. And it just gets very stale, very dry, and very boring very quickly. Now, as I said, a lot of these songs really just blend together, and that's where the big problem comes from. So there aren't too many songs that stand out as being particularly bad, but I have a few that I don't like that I want to talk about, mostly because they left an impression on me of not liking them, rather than just going in one ear out the other, sounding like the track that came before and after it. One of those songs being Trigger, which harkens back to 21 Pilots. Whether that is coincidental or on purpose, I'm not sure. 'Cause you all have guns, but you never put the safety on. Sadly, this is not Guns for Hands. And boy, do I wish I was listening to a Vessel at this point in the album. And this is only track 4, because that album's amazing, and this one's so boring. And that's why this song sticks out, is because I think of 21 Pilots every time, because of the lyrics are very similar to the lyrics on the hook of Guns for Hands. Those lyrics being, "Cause I got the trigger, but you hold the gun, how come you never put the safety on? And you all have plans." And I wish I was listening to that song instead of this one. And the other song that stood out to me as being not great was Inordinary. Not for any particular reason, but out of all the songs on this album, I just found this one to be most of a slog. Like, I was torturing myself to get through it, that it was just going on and on and on, and just not ending. And it just felt like it was just dragging so hard, and was just such a difficult song to get through on each listen of this album. And that's why I think it's one of the weaker tracks on here. The rest of the tracks, though, mostly blend together and are just really boring. And that's my big problem with this album, is just how boring it is. It's all so similar. I can't really differentiate between any of these songs because they're all the same, both kind of idealistically and thematically, and musically, with the same boring ass acoustic guitars and light drumming over and over and over again. It almost feels like I'm in some kind of repetitive hell listening to this album, and it's unfortunate because Hayley Williams is so talented, and that's where it becomes so disappointing that after an amazing album like Petals for Armor, we get a folklore clone. And maybe clone isn't the right word. I think it does enough to differentiate itself from folklore, and I do think it's better, like I said, because Hayley's vocals are really good. I think Hayley Williams is an excellent vocalist, and that brings me into there are some highlights on this album, a couple of songs I do want to mention. So shout out to my Beach Boys Love You vinyl. I had it in the background, but you couldn't necessarily see it over my head. I didn't know how that was going to work. Now, there are a couple of songs on this album I like. I think the album starts off pretty strong with a pretty good 3-track run. First Thing to Go, while being just like every other song on the album, is the first one you hear, so it's not stale yet. You think, you know what, this is pretty good. My Limb has the most character and personality probably out of any song on this album. It's a bit darker. There are some, like, ascending chords that really remind me of the early 2000s, a lot of the rock music of the early 2000s, and Hayley's vocals, once again, are great here. She really settles into a lower register that would make some basses ashamed of themselves, and I just think it sounds great. I think the darker atmosphere of the song really does a lot to make it stand out, and a song that is actually genuinely really beautiful as is Asystole, or as I like to say, Asystole, like it's a medicine. I've been prescribed Asystole, one of those commercials. But that's a genuinely beautiful song, specifically the piano and instrumental solo and breakdown at the end of the song is just gorgeous. My favorite moment on this album. Um, HYD is a pretty good song, as I think it is a lot sadder than a lot of the songs on this album are. I think it stands out as being pretty sad. And one of the few songs on this album that made a really big emotional connection to me, HYD standing for How Are You Doing? And it just connected with me and resonated with me a lot more than any of the other tracks on this album. And finally, my favorite track is Closing Moment, Just a Lover, because Hayley finally fucks off with the acoustic guitars and does something different. And this is a bit more of a straightforward rock track, focusing on pianos for the first bit, introducing some more crisp and heavier drumming, and having some distorted electric guitars, which sound great by the time we get here, the closing track. It took until the closing track of this goddamn album to do something new. That being said, it's good. And it shows that this album could have been so much better because we have moments like Just a Lover and the second half of Asystole, or Asystole, or My Limb, or H by D that do different things that if all of these tracks were this varied, it could have been really good instead of being boring like it is. But instead, she chose to repeat herself, and that's all this album feels like it is. It's just repeating itself like a broken record. And that's sad because I think Hayley Williams is very talented and has the potential to make an amazing album and an amazing sad album. But I do think this is the worst thing Hayley Williams has ever made, and it's not even close. My second least favorite being Paramore's album Riot, and I think Riot is 1,000 times the album this is. I don't know what I want to score this. I'm between two scores. I was thinking a 6 minus, but I'm thinking I'm gonna have to give Flowers for Vases a 5 plus out of 10. Just a really disappointing record overall. And I'm sorry, I hope you know this is just my opinion. And this is as someone who loves Paramore, loves Hayley Williams, like I said, Petals for Armor, made my year-end list in 2020. After Laughter made my albums of the decade list. If I wouldn't have had a one artist per rule, or one album per artist rule, Self-Titled would have made that list. Brand New Eyes is one of my favorite albums of all time. And I love All We Know Is Falling. And Riot, while I have my problems and don't come back to it as much as I used to, it's still a good album. And this just comes off as boring and not taking advantage of Hayley's talents or potential as a songwriter or lyricist. It does take advantage of her vocalist abilities, though, her vocal abilities, with her singing being beautiful on this album. But yeah, overall, I'm not a fan. Sorry, guys. Let me know what you think of this in the comments below. And I'll see you all next time.